Why are we so gridlocked trying to solve the problem of gun violence in the United States? You know, the recent mass shootings that have reignited conversations about the alarming rates of gun violence in the United States is happening again. But why can't we make any substantive changes as a nation that actually makes a difference? Every time we've been here before, nothing changes. Why is that the case? What is wrong with the soul of America that we can be so uncompassionate and persist in the same direction after these senseless murders, especially about when thinking about the racial violence and these little children, these fourth graders in the classroom? If you're struggling with this pattern like I am, stay tuned. So let's begin. And first, it's important to remember that we have jumped to nearly 40,000 gun deaths annually. This is an overwhelming number when we consider it from a global perspective. And it's even more concerning when we think about the terror it has created for us as a people. National polling reports that 58% of all Americans have either experienced gun violence themselves or someone they know has. So considering the widespread trauma that it has caused all of us, we should acknowledge that we are living in a state of gun violence terror. One scary reality is that gun violence is on the rise and mass shootings are becoming more and more frequent, and yet overall crime is actually decreasing. So when considering the annual 40,000 gun deaths, about 54% of those deaths are suicides and 43% are murders. And I guess about like 3% fall into the category of other. And 79% of all murders are done by guns, and 53% of suicides involve guns. And as you can imagine, the suicides committed with guns are much more efficient than suicides by other methods. In the US, there was a general spike in gun purchases during the Obama years, and also a serious surge during the pandemic as well. It is estimated that there are about 400 million guns in circulation, though some people estimate as much as 500 million guns, right? And this is where things are particularly challenging for us because we not only live under gun violence terror, but America has a deeply seated gun culture as well. So the second thing I want to address is that we need to remember and explore the debate that continues to happen around gun violence. Right now, there's a debate about whether the reason for all the gun deaths is because of the limited or no screening, limited or no registration of guns, limited or no training of those who have guns, and generally because there are just so many guns per capita in the United States, versus those that suggest that the problem isn't guns, it's people, and particularly people with mental health problems. So I personally don't find the mental health answer sufficient for explaining all of our gun violence in this country by itself. And yet, I don't want to skip over that reality either. It does seem that mental health is a very serious problem that continues to spike. There is evidence that mental health problems have continually increased with the increase of smartphones and social media usage that itself is a crisis that needs to be addressed and taken seriously. Aside from that, a little over half of all gun deaths every year are suicides, as I mentioned already. The people most vulnerable to suicide by gun death are white men. White men also happen to be the most likely to own guns, right, in the United States. And this is where common sense can be helpful. While it is true that guns by themselves don't kill people, people with guns make it easier to kill people. And when thinking about gun regulation versus mental health, think about it like this. Someone with depression or suicidal ideation with an easily accessible gun is more dangerous than someone with depression or suicidal ideation without access to any guns, right? This is why many nations who have basic common sense regulations have zero gun deaths many years, and they don't have equivalent suicide and homicides as the US does, just through some other means, right? They're not equivalents in knivings and bombings as we have in gun deaths. The overall global evidence is quite clear and striking. The more guns per capita in a country overall, the more gun deaths, right? And the more universal and consistent common sense gun regulations are implemented, the fewer gun deaths. And so there are some things basic ideas that we can run with. But I don't think this means, again, that we should take mental health off the table when talking about gun violence. I think that mental health is clearly tied to gun violence rates. And based on some research, one of the things I learned is that the problem of mass shootings is that some consider mass shooters themselves as having suicidal ideation or self-hatred. And so in their case, what's different than normal, self-hatred is that they're actually projecting their hatred outwards, often to racial minorities, sexual minorities, those of a different gender, religious minorities, or peers. So mental health and the easy access to guns together are leading to the increase in the frequency of mass shootings. And again, white men who are most susceptible to committing suicide by guns are by far the most likely to engage in mass shootings as well, while black men are much more likely to participate or be victims to gun homicides, but way less likely to commit mass shootings in comparison to white men. I'll make one more really brief point on guns in the United States before I kind of take us a little deeper. And who has had access to guns and who has often been denied access to guns has a deeply racialized history. I'm going to encourage everyone to read Carol Anderson's book, The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. To understand this history more in depth, you've got to understand that from before the official founding of the nation, through the writing of the Constitution, through the Jim Crow era, through the civil rights and black power struggle, up until our present, the story of guns and race has been deeply entrenched into the story of race. Black people in general and black men in particular were denied access to guns, while white people and white men in particular depended on guns to sustain racial oppression through all of its different manifestations. Black men with a gun have often created hysteria in white conscience, which is no wonder unarmed black men and other black people have been shot wielding nothing but wallets, iced tea and Skittles, or toys. So while we need to have conversations about mental health and guns, we have yet to have an honest reckoning of our nation's racially stratified story of guns. And when we do, it may help us to begin to understand why some are so quick to cling to the constitutional Second Amendment as an excuse for not revising our national commitments so that the fundamental right to life can actually be upheld. Not just the right to own guns, but the right to life. My suspicion is that our history of race has contributed to America's idolatry that creates our death-dealing gun culture and our climate of terror. So finally, I'm a theologian, and my ethical commitments begin and ends with the story of Jesus Christ. The gospel story of Jesus' birth, his radical life and ministry, his subversive teachings, his crucifixion, and his resurrection over death is the orienting narrative of my life. And while I don't have time to unpack everything now, one of the most defining characteristics of Jesus' ministry, especially in the context of living under Roman imperial occupation as a first century Jew in Palestine, right, is the way that all four of the Gospels demonstrate Jesus' rejection of the violence of both Rome, right, the empire, as well as providing an alternative to the Jewish freedom fighters of his own day. Instead, Jesus taught to love one's enemies, that we ought to be peacemakers, and his Sermon on the Mount invited us to engage in creative, nonviolent resistance to evil rather than to respond to evil with evil. And the greatest demonstration, I think, that Jesus sought to break cycles of violence rather than perpetuate them and increase violent patterns, I think can be seen in his resistance of the powerful and the unjust, but yet refusing to shed the blood of others, right? For Jesus, those who live by the sword die by the sword, right? In the United States, there are many American biblicists that have broken from the historic interpretation of certain biblical texts, bending them and contorting them to fit their ideological commitments. most of Christian tradition has kind of vacillated between those who've been committed to, fully living peace and nonviolence in their lives as an expression of their discipleship to Jesus, and those who adhere to just war principles and therefore believe that there are extreme circumstances that require Christians to act responsibly on behalf of others, right? Those are debates to be had, and maybe one day I'll explore that in a video itself. But now I want to mention that there are pro-gun advocates that have begun to be so ideological in their commitments that they have manipulated the gospel story, some even claiming that Jesus whipped people in the temple, which is a bad reading of the text, and some even saying that his teachings saying that he did not come to bring peace but a sword is suggesting pro-sword, pro-gun kind of ideology. I can promise you this, even a sloppy biblical scholar can tell you that has nothing to do with being pro-swords. It has everything to do with the eschatological implications of God's kingdom clashing with the kingdom of this world, and it's not Jesus's call to arms, right? Anyway, the Jesus story does not provide us with direct answers on the kind of policy we should implement, but it is unashamedly oriented towards peacemaking in the Hebrew scriptures vision of shalom on earth. And so I don't see how any committed disciple of Jesus can choose the American Constitution over the ethics of Jesus. And especially when it directly relates to our ability to actually love and protect our neighbors. Jesus is Lord, the Constitution is not. And so to the degree that the Constitution bends us towards God's peace and justice, it ought to be utilized. And to the degree that it crushes the flourishing and well-being of others, it ought to be transformed. Putting the American Constitution above Jesus is the definition of idolatrous. So as we reckon with all the Black lives lost while grocery shopping and think about and remember all these fourth grade little children whose lives were lost in the classroom, anyone committed to peace and justice should be hungering and thirsting for a world set right and willing to do whatever it takes. And we must count the cost and accept the consequences of joining the movement for actual change so everyone can be safe. It's really my hope that this time, as we're having a conversation again around gun violence in the nation, that things can actually change and that we'd be committed to making transformative ways that demonstrate that we still have a soul, right? And care about the least, last, and lost, and our neighbors and those most vulnerable in our society.